let's go to the Arizona Cardinals next, because this is a team that I think is certainly worth a good conversation here. They finished last year 8-9. That was third in the NFC West. We have their projected win total this year at 8.7, so just under 9. So pretty competitive there, I think, with a lot of these other teams that we will hear in this division. Last year, their offensive grade of an 81.0 was tied for 7th in the NFL. Their defense, 64.8, that was 23rd. When I look at this Cardinals team, I think there's a lot of talent here, especially when you look at sort of what they did in free agency as well, bringing in a guy like Josh Sweat, I think, can really help along the defensive line. Marvin Harrison Jr. taking that next step, I think, is going to be absolutely huge for them. They brought in a guy like Dalvin Tomlinson to give them more beef in the middle. Calais Campbell's the same way. They brought back Bam Browning. They have Darius Robinson, who you hope takes that next step along the defensive line as well. And so I like the talent that they have on this team. But Dalton, for me to this point, and this has sort of been the Kyler Murray era for the Cardinals, they can compete with anybody. But then the peaks and the valleys, the gap is the wavelength is way too big, in my opinion. There's too many times where I go, man, the Cardinals just competed with one of the best teams in the NFL, or even got a win against one of the best teams in the NFL. And then the next week, or even 2 weeks later, whatever it is, they're playing with their food, as the saying goes, right? They're playing with teams that they should be much better than, or that they would have been much better than if they were the same version of the team that they were 2 weeks prior when they were playing one of the better teams in the NFL. I just think that variance is far too high and low right now for the Cardinals. And if you want me to be honest, that's what I'm looking to see from this team. Because what was it going into week 8, or was it going into week 10? I think it was going into week 10. This team was number 1 in the division. Like, they were feeling themselves. They were thinking playoffs. And then all of a sudden, it sputters to the point where down the stretch, they finished 3rd in the division. Now, 8-9 is not a terrible record, but it just goes to show the team was too hot and cold. There was not that consistency. And so we can talk about the roster, we can talk about the players, but at the end of the day, for me, with the Cardinals, it's about the consistency. And if this team plays consistent, if they raise their floor, I legitimately feel like they are playing for a division title this year and a playoff spot. What do you think about the Arizona Cardinals and really just the Kyler Murray era to this point?
Yeah, with Kyler and with the whole team, it does come down to consistency. And you even mentioned, they were 23rd in PFF grade on defense. Well, that was an improvement, at least, from being dead last the year before. So we did see moments where their defense was better, and they've continued to build the depth, I think, especially on the D-line and at cornerback this offseason. So I do like the direction that their defense is going, kind of incrementally improving. But you're right, this is about being hot and cold, being a little bit streaky, and I think it goes right along with Kyler Murray. I don't know that there is a more maybe make or break quarterback both for his team and his career this season in the league than Kyler Murray. I think there's a lot of pressure on him to get this team, to find a way to get this team back to the playoffs, right? To find a way to be more consistent on a week to week. And honestly, you watch some of these Cardinal games, it feels like quarter to quarter, or it feels like just a couple of drive to drive, you're not sure which Kyler Murray, which offense that you're getting. The constants are James Conner and Trey McBride right now. I think Marvin Harrison's going to continue to get better, but it just feels like this team, there's not very many football games last year where from front to back for 60 minutes that they played the same caliber of football, right? You just always felt like there was moments, and then for 2 or 3 drives it stalled, and then there were games, I can think about against the Rams and the Seahawks where they were very low scoring and they were losing like 13-9. You just can't have, like you mentioned, that level of peaks and valleys. And I think Kyler Murray really embodies that. When he's great, it's awesome. I think there were 6 games last year where he had at least a 70 passing grade. They won 5 out of those 6 games. The problem is in the rest of them, they went 3-8 because they just don't have a ton of depth on this team. So they really need the stars, including Murray, to play well. And when they don't, there's not a ton of other answers. I know they're trying to build that more and more this offseason, but you're absolutely right. Week to week, it can be hard to tell which Arizona Cardinals team that you're getting.
Yeah, I'm looking at their schedule from last year, and I think that win at the beginning of the year against the Rams, we sort of counted that as a signature win for them, but they really didn't have one after that. I think that the Chargers win was a good win, but it was still just a 2-point win in a low-scoring game. They ended up winning that game 17-15. But other than that, the best wins that they have on their schedule Yeah, sure. At San Francisco, it was a good win in week 5, but we remember, that San Francisco game. That's the game that we talk about with the Niners, and we'll talk about the Niners here in a second. That to me was the realization game that the Niners just weren't going to be a good run defense team. That was the game that James Conner absolutely went off in the third and fourth quarters, and they just kept handing him the ball simply because the Niners could not stop them on defense when they were just handing the ball off. They end up winning that game by 1. And I don't want to take anything away from them there. A road game, especially a division game, that's a big one. But you go throughout the season, the rest of their wins were that Chargers game that you win by 2, the Dolphins, who weren't good last year, the Bears, who weren't good last year, the Jets, who weren't good last year, the Patriots, who weren't good last year, and then they end the season against the Niners. And obviously the Niners, just like I said, we're not a good team. The rest of their losses, I mean, they lost to Buffalo, they lost to Detroit, they lost to the Commanders, they lost to the Packers, they lost to the Seahawks twice, they lost to Minnesota. Most of the losses they had were to the best teams they played last year. And to me, that just goes into, I just feel like they were not playing in rhythm well enough. They're too high variance of a team. They're talented enough to compete with those better teams, but they just didn't have enough consistency, even in a game by game or even in a quarter by quarter basis, to finish those games the way that they needed to. Let's look at the biggest strengths that you have on this team there that you had listed for this team, and it is that rushing attack. They leaned on that quite a bit. They've got that dual threat ability with what Kyler can do with his legs. Then you got guys like James Conner. You get Trey Benson as well coming up too. So you feel like they're going to continue to run the ball this year, and that's going to be their strength?
Yeah, that's the constant in this offense. Jonathan Gannon on both sides of the ball is trying to be the more physical team on the field, right? And I think even all those games you just mentioned, look at the games that you listed, most of them that they lost, right? When you talk about even Detroit, Buffalo's better in run defense than they are in coverage. There's a lot of those teams. Seattle's a solid run defense that's getting better, especially on the inside. And then you look at the teams they beat, the Bears, the Jets, you mentioned the 49ers, teams that can't stop the run, and the more they can lean on this run game in Arizona, those are the games they're actually winning, right? You avoid the high variance Kyler Murray passing game. You get down, you run the football. James Conner had the 6th best rushing grade in football last year. Kyler Murray's obviously a dynamic option threat, over 7 yards a carry last year. Trey Benson, Amari DiMercato, multiple tight ends on the field. They'll get in 12 or even 13 personnel and then ride the play action off of that after they get this run game going. But to me, when I watch this team, that's the biggest constant, more than Kyler Murray, more than what they're trying to do on defense and getting better each week. I think they want to get in and run the football. They want to get powerful. They want to use multiple tight ends. They want to get downhill in these duo schemes. They want to be the more physical team, and I think that's the one thing that does show up every week.
To list off a stat that you had here that I really liked in the article, since the start of 2023, James Conner's 92.2 rushing grade and 128 missed tackles forced ranked both second in the NFL behind only Derrick Henry. I think that James Conner does not often get the respect that he deserves. I think that Trey Benson is a fantastic RB2 for this team. And I do think that rushing attack is going to be something that they lean on again this year, because that's where the horses are for this team. Biggest weakness you have as linebacker for this unit. So when we look at this off-ball linebacker unit for this team, it's Mack Wilson, it's Akeem Davis-Gaither, it's Owen Papo, Cody Simon, a guy who they drafted this year, who they could hope and get in the mix there. It feels as though when we talk about the front 7 of this team, I think a lot of people talk about them and they're very excited, right? I mentioned some of the guys on the defensive line, some of the edge rushers that they have, Josh Sweat, BJ Ojulari. They have Xavier Thomas as well, Zaven Collins, Jordan Birch, Baron Browning. There's a lot of guys within their front 7 that you feel pretty good about. But then that off-ball linebacker unit is a little more skeptical. So clearly you're worried about that as a potential Achilles heel for them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look Mack Wilson, Akeem Davis-Gaither, Michael Walker, Cody Simon, a 4th-round rookie. There's obviously not a star in this group. They were 28th in PFF grade last year at linebacker. It's the one part of their defense where, look, I just don't think they got significantly better this offseason, right? They got a ton of defensive linemen. They drafted Walter Nolan in the 1st round. And look, I like Walter Nolan. He's really talented. We haven't seen him in the preseason yet because of a calf injury, and I know we heard that last year with their 1st round pick Darius Robinson. But I think this is the one spot where I go, I just can't. You can't project this to be a highly graded unit. It's not going to be great. I don't think even a lot of these guys have played very well in the preseason. I think this is a team, if there's any available veteran linebackers that come available via trade, I think they're going to be in on it. I really do, because the secondary got better this offseason. I love Will Johnson, and he's going to start on the outside, their 2nd-round pick. I really like the depth of this defensive line, but this second level feels like, to me, the biggest hole on their team right now. I'm really worried about it.
how do you feel about this secondary? I feel like the opinions of the Arizona Cardinals secondary is different from who you ask. And I think a lot of it weighs in on Will Johnson, right? I mean, if Will Johnson can be the CB1 that they believe that his talent level can be, then I think it makes everything look a little bit better. I like Max Melton. I like Garrett Williams. I like Budda Baker, obviously. Jalen Thompson is good. I'm a big Adrian Taylor Demerson fan, so him getting in the mix of safety, I think is going to be impactful for them. But Will Johnson struggled in week 2. He did not have the best of PFF coverage grade. I believe it was in the 30s, but that was also, there was some miscommunication there, I think, on one of those routes that he ended up giving up a big catch. And he kind of very clearly, like, he thought he was supposed to be in one spot. He thought the safety was going to cover the deep in route. And it ended up being that he probably should have covered it there. So that was a little bit more of just a chemistry and a communication thing. But ultimately, how do you feel about this secondary? Because I think really a lot of people's opinions on this team, the defense will go as this secondary goes. So how much faith do you have in this group?
I like it. The way they run it, it's a defense that's designed to just not give up explosive plays, right? It's a lot of quarters and a lot of sitting back and making tackles, right? I think Will Johnson will be able to make the adjustment. I think the big thing is that they're just very young at corner, right? We saw Starling Thomas with the season-ending injury. I mean, you're going to be relying on Will Johnson, Max Melton, maybe even Elijah Jones, who they drafted last year as well. Outside corner is going to be a question, but I think on the inside, they're rock solid. This is quietly one of the better safety groups with the 3 guys you mentioned in Baker and Thompson and Taylor Demerson. And then Garrett Williams became one of the best slot corners in football last year. So on the inside, again, it's kind of weird because you've got this weakness at linebacker, but you're really good at safety and in the slot. But one of the developments for this defense is going to be, how did all these young outside corners develop throughout the season, right? Who are the guys that are going to emerge as their starters? Because they're very young outside at corner. I think they're really talented, and I think it's a defense that does protect those guys to an extent, but it's going to take some time. But to me, I'm optimistic on Will Johnson. Again, he was a top 15 to 20 talent in the draft, and he dropped because of medicals. I think he's going to be a good player, and I really like that he's getting to start week 1 right away because he should have been a first-round pick. And again, just the medicals were the only thing. The knee injury was the only thing that held that out.
I think Cardinals fans might be yelling at us and like, how are you this far into a preview for our team and you haven't even talked about the receiving core? And I think the receiving core is a good one, and we'll talk about that here. It's a good way to usher in our season-long bet that Ben has for this team. But Marvin Harrison Jr., Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, Trey McBride, I like this pass-catching group, especially if Marvin Harrison Jr. is really taking that next step into being the wide receiver 1 for this team. I think that looks really good. And Ben's season-long bet that he has for the Cardinals, Trey McBride, most receiving touchdowns in the NFC West. Now, I think that that's kind of funny, right? Given we talked so much about him not getting into the end zone last year, but obviously this is a heavy volume, heavy target type of player. And I think that it was really just bad luck, a fluke, the fact that he had that no touchdown streak for so long last season. But for McBride to have the most receiving touchdowns in the NFC West, that is plus 1,200. So there's a really good numbers there over at DraftKings if you feel good about a bounce back year from touchdowns. Ben says McBride only had 2 receiving touchdowns in 2024, but he led the division in red zone targets with 21 and ranked among the top 10 in players in the entire NFL in red zone target rate. We should be expecting some positive TD regression or progression, really, in 2025, and 12-1 to lead the division is enticing odds given how talented McBride is, and then certainly his volume that goes along with that. So what do you think about that? I'm not gonna lie, plus 1,200 for McBride given how often they target him in the red zone. That's a pretty juicy number, in my opinion.
No, absolutely. He's one of the best tight ends in football, and it was a record last year, I think. Wasn't it the most receptions to start a season without a touchdown before he got one? I think it was week 16 or 17.
It was either the record or we were so close to it that we were talking about it all the time.
I think
it was one of those two.
I think he at least tied it, and it felt like for a bit there was a few weeks there when even with a lot of those red zone targets, like almost like he was cursed, like he was just never going to score another touchdown in his life. But all of a sudden, I think sometimes with these bets you have to look at the rest of the division, right? And I think you look at the Niners and just the mountain of injuries that they have at wide receiver. Seattle's really going to be working on this passing passing game, and we know Smith and Jigba's the number one target there, but we'll see if he can get more touchdowns than McBride. And then the Rams, obviously, with the Stafford situation, I think the next guy that you think about that you go, okay, that's the guy that would lead the division in touchdowns is Puka Nacua, right? I think that's the one. George Kittle's probably on that list too, but considering the amount that this offense and this passing game revolves around Trey McBride, who's really still right now their best receiving weapon, and a guy they just paid elite money for a tight end, I think it makes sense at 12-1. It's a solid dark horse bet.